Imagine the scene. You've just discovered the perfect web series, an independent production, limited budget, but actresses with a chemistry so real it shows in every breath. Then your favorite actresses from your favorite show finally admit they're together after fiercely denying every rumor. It was real all along. You and the entire fandom explode with happiness. The third season gets announced, this time produced by a major streaming platform with $1 million budget. Now imagine them traveling together to celebrate in a secluded paradise. Everything's perfect, right? Now add $1 million trap set by ruthless men in suits that could destroy any career, and suddenly you have the recipe for an absolute disaster. Grab a blanket and get ready, because the tension here is going to wreck you. Let's set the scene. The sound of the light rain tapping against the car's tinted windows felt like a ticking countdown, methodical, cruel. Inside the vehicle, the AC mingled with the metallic scent of anxiety and the lingering trail of Valentina's perfume, vanilla and cinnamon, unmistakable and devastating, creating a thick, almost suffocating atmosphere. Luiza kept her eyes glued to the blurred landscape outside, her posture so rigid she could have been carved from marble. The silence between them wasn't their usual. It wasn't that soft, comfortable quiet of two people who understand each other without words after so many years. It was a sharp silence, the kind that could slice your skin open if you moved the wrong way. In Luiza's lap, a manila envelope weighed heavier than a lead anchor. The meeting from less than an hour ago still buzzed in their minds like a torturous hum. The plastic smiles of the streamer's new executives, the untouched cups of coffee on the long glass boardroom table, looking like props on a staged set, and the polished words, so carefully chosen, so surgically impersonal, that hid pure venom in every syllable. A heroic death, the head of content had delivered it with the casualness of someone commenting on the weather. A necessary shock for the audience, the engagement analyst had chimed in, not even looking up from her iPad. A new lady for a new era, the CEO had concluded, like he was signing off on a grocery receipt. The death sentence for the couple that had taken the world by storm didn't come with screaming matches, dramatic betrayals, or the honest brutality of a fight. It came with engagement projection spreadsheets, and the refusal clause, a multi-million-dollar penalty that would trap them in insurmountable debt for the rest of their lives, was the final nail in the coffin of their careers. Valentina, the woman who always knew exactly how to reach her girlfriend with just a sidewise glance or a perfectly timed whispered word, was now completely swallowed by her own internal storm. She reached out. Her trembling fingers hesitated for a fraction of a second, just the length of a held breath, before lightly brushing Luiza's wrist. It was a soft touch, almost childlike in its delicacy, a silent plea for an anchor. "I'm here. We're here." But Luiza, driven by her deepest protective instincts, compounded by the absolute panic of losing control of the situation, pulled back just a few millimeters, just enough for the warmth to dissipate into the freezing air of the car. She knew she shouldn't pull away. She knew, somewhere beneath all that terror, that Valentina needed her right then just as much as she needed Valentina. But the weight of that envelope in her lap made it impossible to breathe, let alone comfort the woman she loved. That micro-rejection made Valentina's chest tighten, like a fist closing around her heart. She didn't say a word. She slowly withdrew her hand and brought it back to her own lap, her fingers twisting into a tense knot. The distance between them in the back seat felt so vast, a chasm carved not by a betrayal or a fight, but by corporate suits in a boardroom who understood absolutely nothing about what they had built, about what it had cost, about who depended on it. The betrayal of the fans, the destruction of their legacy, the looming bankruptcy, the fear of waking up for the first time without knowing what they were going to be, everything converged into a single pressure point, threatening to shatter the very foundation holding them up. And the worst part was the quiet certainty starting to settle, slow and ruthless, into both of their hearts. The certainty that love, no matter how deep, might not be enough to protect them from the real world. The scent of damp earth and pine flooded their lungs when they stepped out of the car 2 days later. Ayla and Bruna's inn was tucked away between secluded beaches, surrounded by a dense forest that blanketed the coastline in a lazy, sweeping beauty. It was, by all accounts, paradise. The gentle breeze drifting through the large lobby windows welcomed guests before the doors even fully opened. Bruna's smile, genuine, completely uninterested in viewership or metrics, was a literal antidote to the world they'd left behind in the city, in those glass-walled boardrooms. In their reserved room, the sprawling bed draped in Egyptian cotton sheets looked untouchable, like it had a force field around it. Valentina tossed their bags into the corner with deliberate carelessness, the kind of gesture that, in any other context, would have earned a crooked smile from Luiza, and walked over to the window to watch the night fall over the calm sea. Luiza, meanwhile, didn't even take off her coat. Immediately, with that almost mechanical efficiency that Valentina knew so well and sometimes loved, sometimes feared, Luiza opened her laptop on the small wooden desk and spread the damned pages of the contract under the amber glow of the desk lamp. The sound of paper scratching against wood was the only noise in the room. Valentina watched from a distance. Luiza's shoulders were coiled tight, her shoulder blades pressing against the fabric of her t-shirt like trapped wings. The starvation for intimacy, for a moment of oblivion, for skin and heat, and the close-up scent of her girlfriend burned just beneath the surface of her own skin. She walked slowly to the back of the chair. She stopped right behind Luiza, not touching her. Only the heat of Valentina's body radiated forward, millimeters before contact, and Luiza felt it. Luiza always felt it. Luiza's shoulders twitched slightly, bracing herself, a defense. Valentina leaned in. Her lips brushed almost imperceptibly against the goosebumps on the nape of Luiza's neck. Not quite a kiss, just the heavy promise of one. A raspy whisper slipped into the quiet room like water over stones. "You need to stop for a second," Valentina murmured. "The danger out there isn't coming in here tonight." Luiza closed her eyes. Her breath hitched. The scent of vanilla and cinnamon was so close it felt like it took up physical space. She turned her head, slowly, like someone fighting a rip current, and their eyes locked. Valentina's pupils were blown wide in the dim light, dark and heavy with heat, offering a sanctuary and a total surrender of control. Their breathing synced into a dangerous rhythm, the exact rhythm Luiza recognized from the very first time she had stayed over at Valentina's apartment, when the quiet between them shifted irrevocably. Luiza raised her hand. Her thumb traced the line of Valentina's jaw, feeling the racing pulse beneath the soft skin, that one spot on her neck that betrayed everything Valentina pretended not to feel. The urge to cave was overwhelming, and then Luiza's eyes fell on a highlighted word on the paper spread across the desk. Termination. The spell shattered with the brutality of broken glass. Luiza swallowed hard. She pulled her hand back. She turned back to the screen, her voice coming out colder than she meant it to, colder than she wanted, than was fair, than was true. "I can't, Val," she said. "If I don't find a way out of this, we lose everything." Valentina took a step back. The rejection, masked as responsibility, hurt in an entirely different way. It wasn't the sharp sting of a cruel word, it was the dull ache of a door being carefully, deliberately shut in your face. The chasm between them grew, quiet and methodical, and the night swallowed the room. It was past 3 a.m. when Luiza found the clause. Valentina was sleeping a restless sleep inside, the sheets tangled around her legs, her brow furrowed even in unconsciousness, as if the problems had followed her into her dreams. Out on the covered porch, wrapped in a thick throw blanket and with eyes red from sheer exhaustion, Luiza was reading page 42 for the 5th time. The coffee in her mug was cold and bitter, abandoned at least an hour ago. The wind howled low and steady, almost meditative, but Luiza's mind was miles away from meditation. She was dissecting the corporate legalese like someone trying to defuse a bomb blindfolded, care in every line, terror in every comma. And then her eyes locked. Buried in a maze of technical jargon about licensing and copyrights, there was a paragraph, long, dense, sandwiched between two dry subsections on broadcast compliance, a morality and image clause. It stated, in deliberately convoluted and vague wording, the kind of language that means everything and nothing, or everything depending on who's reading it, that the platform was prohibited from drastically altering the core structure of intellectual properties if such alterations directly conflicted with the moral obligations and brand positioning tied to Tier 1 sponsors. Luiza's heart skipped a beat. She read it again, slowly this time, as if the speed could alter the meaning of the words. And again. What was this? A real loophole? A cloaked safeguard left by someone who anticipated this exact scenario? Or just empty legal fluff, 16 lines of absolutely nothing tossed in to pad the page count and give the illusion of protection without the substance? The frustration of not knowing made her let out a shaky breath, rubbing her freezing hands over her face. The uncertainty was a slow, quiet poison, and she had no idea if she'd just found the antidote or a particularly cruel mirage. The soft padding of bare feet against the hardwood made Luiza snap her head around. Valentina stood in the glass doorway separating the porch from the bedroom. She was wearing nothing but Luiza's oversized t-shirt, the worn-out gray one she'd stolen months ago and never gave back, slipping off one shoulder. Her hair was a messy bedhead, her eyes heavy from interrupted sleep, and there was no armor left, no performance, no careful distance, just a woman standing in a doorway, looking at another, framed by an unusually bitter night. Valentina's eyes met Luiza's, and this time there was no teasing, just raw, naked vulnerability, the kind no camera had ever captured or ever would. The space between them, the 6 feet of freezing porch and damp air, felt like a minefield. Luiza gripped the paper tightly, feeling her throat close up. They had both reached the absolute limit of their emotional exhaustion, and the question hanging heavy in the air desperately demanded an answer. Neither of them said a word. Valentina leaned her shoulder against the glass frame and crossed her arms, shielding her chest from the chill or from something else. "You found something," she said, and it wasn't a question. "Maybe. I don't know. It might be nothing. But it might be something." Luiza looked down at the paper, then back up at Valentina. "Yeah, it might be something." The silence that followed was different from the ones before. It was a silence that breathed. Valentina uncrossed her arms and walked over to Luiza's chair, slipping right into her lap without asking permission, pulling an edge of the blanket to cover her freezing legs. She held out her hand, without a hint of hesitation this time, and Luiza handed her the paper. They stayed like that, together, reading by the amber glow of the desk lamp cutting through the dark porch while the wind howled outside. The next morning, the smell of freshly baked bread and strong coffee filled the inn's main dining room, but the breakfast spread on the rustic wooden table felt more like a wake. Luiza and Valentina stirred their mugs mechanically. Deep, bruised bags under their eyes betrayed the war they'd waged through the night. The effervescent chemistry that usually lit up any room they walked into had been replaced by a heavy shadow. Not the sharp, freezing shadow from the day before, but the thick, exhausting weight of two people who are too tired to pretend everything is fine, but too deeply tethered to be anywhere else. Ayla walked in carrying a platter of fresh fruit, using it as an excuse to cross the room. She was a woman with sharp eyes and a grounding presence, the kind of calm that isn't a lack of power, but the exact opposite of it all. She stopped dead in the middle of the room. 5 seconds. That's all it took. She set the platter down and took a seat right across from them without asking permission, moving with the ease of someone who knows the invitation is already there, that the crushing weight around these two women was an invitation in itself. "All right, spill it," Ayla said. Simple, direct, no condescending "what's wrong" or affected "can I do anything to help." The silence lasted the length of 2 breaths, and then the dam broke. The words spilled out of Luiza, tripping over one another, entirely stripped of the order and control she usually weaponized in her speech. the gruesome plan for the script, the replacement actress already signed, already running lines, the senseless death engineered purely for shock value to manufacture the kind of calculated trauma that keeps people rage tweeting for weeks, the seven-figure contractual trap designed to make walking away impossible, the sheer terror of losing not just their careers, but the very identities they had bled to build over the years. And the betrayal, because it was a betrayal, there was no better word for it, of millions of queer women who saw these characters as a safe mirror, maybe the only one they had. Ayla listened without interrupting, her expression hardened by degrees, not with coldness, but with the specific flintiness of someone dead serious cataloging actionable intel. Valentina, sitting next to Luiza, had found her girlfriend's hand under the table at some point during the retelling, a desperate, almost painfully intense grip, and this time Luiza squeezed back just as hard. Almost as an afterthought tossed into the wind, already tainted by the resignation of someone mentioning a detail just for the record, Luiza brought up the clause on page 42, the vague wording about Tier 1 sponsors, the moral obligations and brand positioning. Ayla froze. Her coffee cup hovered inches from her lips. The businesswoman's gaze shifted with the flick of a switch. It went from the gentle empathy of a host to something entirely different, sharper, laser-focused, something Luiza instinctively recognized because she'd seen it on her own face right when she stumbled onto a solution she didn't even know was a solution yet. "Let me see that contract," Ayla said.
Her voice was dangerously calm. It wasn't a plea for comfort. It wasn't curiosity. It was the exact tone of a predator who had just caught the scent of blood. Luiza stared at her for a beat. Then she pulled the manila envelope from her bag, the one she'd carried to breakfast like it was crime scene evidence, and handed it over. The paper changed hands over the table of warm bread, and with it, something Luiza couldn't quite put into words shifted too. Not exactly control, they'd lost control days ago in a glass box in the city, but maybe the loneliness of the burden. Maybe that. "You two stay here," Ayla said, standing up. "I'm going to my office." And she was gone. The hours that followed were a contained agony. Ayla had locked herself in the inn's office with the contract and a series of phone calls that, judging by the muffled, sharp tone bleeding through the heavy door when Valentina paced past it, were confidential enough to make the air in the hallway feel thick. Luiza and Valentina retreated to their cabin. Waiting carries a very specific texture when you don't know if you're waiting for a lifeline or the official confirmation of your ruin. It turns the oxygen into something dense, something hard to swallow. It makes every passing minute feel like a physical object, heavy and jagged. A storm had rolled in outside, stripping away the subtlety of the drizzle. This was a real torrential downpour, wind lashing at the glass with almost personal violence. The cabin was dark despite it still being daytime. Luiza had tried booting up her laptop twice and gave up before clicking a single file. Valentina had tried to read and ended up leaving the book face down on the mattress. They orbited each other in the small space like two planets whose paths never actually collided, but whose gravitational pull was impossible to ignore. At some point in the afternoon, Luiza was standing with her back to the room, staring blindly at the storm through the glass. She didn't hear Valentina walk up, or maybe she did and just didn't react, which amounted to the same thing. Valentina's hands found Luiza's waist. It wasn't a delicate approach this time, no brushing lips against the nape of her neck, no unspoken questions. It was a firm, grounding touch that didn't take no for an answer, a gesture that screamed, "I know you're in here, and I refuse to let you lose yourself in that window." Luiza's back pressed flush against Valentina's chest. The tremor in her bottom lip was inevitable. "We did everything we could," Valentina whispered, her hot breath fanning the curve of Luiza's neck. The sound of the rain battering the glass filled the negative space between her words. "The control isn't in your hands anymore." A pause, a second that stretched on for miles. "Let go. It was the exact phrase she needed. Not relax, not it's going to be okay, just that. Let go. Luiza turned around slowly. Her tear-filled eyes met the dark intensity of Valentina's gaze. There was nothing left to pretend, nothing left to micromanage, no spreadsheets between them, no manila envelopes. There was only the shared acknowledgement that the outside world had tried to break them, and yet they were still standing. They were still here. They were still them. Luiza's touch on Valentina's face was trembling at first. Her thumb traced the line of her cheekbone with the focus of someone committing the texture of something deeply precious to memory. Valentina stayed perfectly still, letting herself be touched, which for her was the ultimate surrender of trust. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to keep you at arm's length, but I couldn't bear the thought of losing you right beside me, living our dream, everything we've built together since the beginning. It can't end like this. It's not fair to the fans or to us. I want you on set with me, my love. No one else. Don't apologize. I know you were worried, but we've already done everything we could, Valentina whispered. It's out of our hands now. No matter what happens, we're going to face it together. A beat. A single second that stretched out into eternity. Luiza closed the distance between them. She pulled Valentina into a fierce embrace, gripping the nape of her neck, her fingers tangling in her girlfriend's golden hair, an aching, desperate gesture that contrasted heavily with the overflowing love between them. I love you, Val, so much. I love you, Luiza, so much. The space between them simply evaporated. The pent-up hunger, the desperation, and the yearning spilled over all at once in a searing connection that was anything but gentle, yet entirely real. The shadows in the room danced as their clothes hit the hardwood floor, the sounds of the storm outside muffled by heavy breathing, and the kind of heat two people generate when they finally stop running from each other. It was like a dam breaking, flooding a dry valley, one storm colliding with another until they merged into a single force, boundaryless, blurring the lines of where one ended and the other began. The outside world, the clauses, the executives, the spreadsheets, the plastic smiles, melted away, consumed entirely by the lights going out and a fire that burned straight through to dawn.
The next morning crept through the cabin window with a shy, golden sun, the kind that shows up after a brutal storm like a quiet apology. It spilled over the tangled sheets and their intertwined bodies, Valentina with her face buried in Luiza's neck, breathing the slow, rhythmic breaths of someone who had actually slept, who had finally found rest. Luiza woke up to the smell of Valentina's hair. Her heart was beating at a steady, peaceful pace that she didn't even recognize at first because it had been days since she felt it. The phone on the nightstand buzzed. She reached for it carefully to avoid waking Valentina, praying it was nothing, hoping she could just ignore it and stay wrapped in that bed a little longer. But it was Ayla. A text message. Come to the office. Ayla's office was tucked into the back of the inn, separated from the guest quarters by a short hallway and a heavy oak door. Luiza and Valentina walked in with their hair still damp, jackets thrown hastily over yesterday's clothes, and found Ayla sitting behind a desk, buried in paperwork. She had the look of someone who hadn't slept a wink, but radiated the electric energy of someone who had spent the night winning a war. There were 2 fresh cups of coffee waiting for them. Bruna was leaning against the bookshelf in the back, arms crossed, watching them quietly. Ayla skipped the preamble. "Sit down." They sat. "First of all," Ayla started, "that clause you found is bulletproof. It isn't empty fluff. It was drafted by someone who knew exactly what they were doing, engineered for a scenario exactly like this." Luiza felt Valentina, right beside her, let out a breath she'd been holding. "Second of all," Ayla continued, interlacing her fingers on the desk, "I don't just run a bed and breakfast." It was a simple sentence delivered with the calculated weight of someone who knows exactly how hard the drop is going to hit. In the back of the room, Bruna let the faintest smirk slip. Right then and there, Luiza and Valentina found out that Ayla wasn't just an incredible host, she was a multi-millionaire, the heiress to an empire her family built decades before she was even born. On top of that, Ayla had a law degree. She'd never actually practiced, but despite the fast-paced lifestyle she led before retreating to the inn, she had been a brilliant student. She knew exactly what she was doing, armed with a network of connections that was arguably worth more than money itself. Overnight, Ayla compiled a dossier, not an emotional manifesto about queer narratives and the importance of representation, though she had those arguments queued up and they absolutely mattered, not a plea to the executive's creative sensitivities, because Ayla understood perfectly well that creative sensitivity wasn't a language spoken in that boardroom. The dossier spoke their native tongue. It mapped out with surgical precision exactly how the sensationalized death of a central queer character, orchestrated for cheap shock value and short-term engagement, was a direct violation of the diversity and brand positioning agreements signed with their Tier 1 sponsors. It cited legal precedents from rival platforms. It projected, using hard, realistic numbers, the devastating PR nightmare that would inevitably trigger once the information leaked, and it would leak because these things always leak. It estimated the exact loss of advertising revenue. It calculated the cost, to the dollar, of a forced reversal against a voluntary immediate pivot. "I fired this off last night," Ayla said smoothly, "to the platform's legal team and 2 board members, CC'd the Investor Relations Department." Silence hung in the air. "Will that be enough?" Luiza asked, hesitant. "I mean, they probably ran the numbers and projections already. Maybe they think the engagement spike outweighs the hit." "You'd be right, but there's one tiny detail I left out." "Ayla always wanted to be an actress," Bruna chimed in, still leaning against the shelf. "When we met, her favorite thing to do was read scripts and study cinema. When we moved out here, she fell in love with this life, but her plans for the industry just took on a different shape. Instead of acting, she funnels her resources into producing, sponsoring film and TV projects that actually mean something, that align with her values." "And?" Luiza asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. Ayla spun her laptop around so the 2 of them could read the screen. It was an email. It had landed 40 minutes ago. The sender? The streaming giant's legal department. The phrase "original narrative restored" jumped out in the 3rd paragraph, death arc scrapped in the 4th, original director reinstated in the 5th. The entire email was draped in the careful, cynical PR speak of a corporation desperately walking back a colossal screw-up without actually admitting fault, packed with buzzwords about creative integrity and honoring the original creator's vision. Luiza read it twice, then a 3rd time. Valentina slapped a hand over her mouth. "It's done," Ayla said, with the breezy simplicity of closing a tab. "You'll have a revised contract to sign by the end of the week. The penalty clause has been entirely gutted, and the original script, with both of your characters fully intact, is officially back in production." Bruna pushed off the bookshelf, flashing the first real, full-blown smile of the morning. Valentina looked at Luiza. Luiza looked at Valentina. There was a stretch of time where neither of them could form a word, and it lasted much longer than either anticipated. It wasn't euphoria. It was something much quieter, much deeper, the visceral relief of exhaling after holding your breath underwater for far too long. "Why did you do this?" Luiza asked, looking back at Ayla. "You didn't owe us anything." Ayla considered the question, her expression sobering. "It wasn't that long ago that Bruna and I were navigating this world without a single story like yours on our screens," she said finally. Her voice was level, but there was a deep, resonant warmth to it, the kind of grounded tone reserved for old truths. "One of my holding companies is the largest sponsor of queer programming on that platform. My legal team forced that exact morality clause into our contracts, strictly to protect us from bullshit like this. I'm just glad fate found a way to drop this mess into my lap. I would have been sick to my stomach if I found out after the fact that my money helped gut the exact representation I've spent years trying to build. What you two did with that indie production company, it mattered to me." Silence. "So," Ayla concluded, raising her coffee mug in a mock toast, "consider a personal debt paid in full." Months later, the massive studio lights on the main set were blazing. The chaotic chatter of the crew, the smell of cheap craft service coffee, the heat radiating off the lighting rigs, the electric, unmistakable pulse of a TV set in full swing, everything they had been terrified they'd never experience again was right there, crowded and loud and overwhelmingly welcome. Luiza and Valentina hit their marks for the first scene of season 3. The director, who had bounced back with the chaotic, triumphant energy of someone who had also narrowly dodged a bullet, watched them for a beat before throwing up a thumbs up. The script supervisor double-checked the blocking. The camera op locked in the frame. "Quiet on set," the clapperboard snapped. The chemistry between them didn't require rehearsals. It exploded through the camera lens with the raw gravitational pull of something that had been dammed up and finally unleashed, stronger, more visceral, and infinitely more real than anything the previous seasons had ever managed to capture. There was a new edge to it, not just between the characters, but bleeding through the eyes of the women inhabiting them, the kind of spark you can't choreograph, the kind that only ignites when the people on screen are actually carrying the weight of the story they're telling. The fandom would eventually hail this season as the absolute peak of the series. They'd praise the writing, the directing, the powerhouse performances. They'd pen endless video essays on the characters' growth and the creators' narrative bravery. They'd celebrate it as a colossal victory, and it was unequivocally a colossal victory, blissfully unaware that it had been a bloodbath, unaware of the sheer drop of the cliff the two actresses had been dangling over, unaware of the name of a woman in a mountain inn who stayed up until dawn dissecting a legal trap, purely out of love for a story that wasn't even hers. As the camera rolled, Luiza delivered her line, her eyes locked dead on to Valentina. They were script lines, typed by someone else, meant for a fictional character, but there was a vibrating frequency beneath the dialogue that belonged exclusively to them. A phantom smile tugged at the corner of Valentina's mouth. "We made it." "Cut!" the director yelled, absolutely thrilled, but the two of them didn't stop kissing. "Man, I definitely need to get a girlfriend," the director muttered. The tension on set dissolved into easy laughter. Someone cracked a joke by the video village. The camera op swung the rig to set up the next angle. The script supervisor scribbled her notes. Luiza and Valentina stayed anchored to their marks, their eyes glued to each other for a second longer than professionally necessary, completely aware of the crew buzzing around them and not giving a single solitary damn. They had learned through the absolute worst and best ways possible that loving someone wasn't just the flawless chemistry you show when the cameras were rolling. It was the grit to hold each other's hands when the lights were killed. It was surrendering control when control had mutated into a cage. It was showing up on a freezing porch at 3 in the morning, wearing the wrong t-shirt with sleep-heavy eyes, not to fix it, but just to be there. It was the loophole buried on page 42. It was the manila envelope, the bitter coffee, and the razor-sharp silence in the back of a car in the pouring rain. It was all of that, and it was this too. Two faces inches apart beneath the blistering studio lights, deeply aware that the real story, the one that couldn't possibly fit into a script, the one no camera would ever capture, was only just beginning to be written. The director yelled for first positions, and the set surged back to life around them. Valentina blinked first. "Ready," she murmured, soft and low, meant for Luiza and absolutely no one else. Luiza nodded, and they went back to work. Because true love isn't just the flawless chemistry you show on camera. It's about having the courage to hold each other's hands when the lights finally go out. See you in the next drama.